Hello, hello. Happy Monday again, everybody. A very special Monday over here at Renew Institute as we are in our very first day in our new space. We really just moved second floor to first floor, but we were really able to expand the square footage and be able to really start to dream big and really hone in on some new ways that we can grow and expand our patient experience. So excited to have you guys with me from my new office and a little bit of a new background, although it may not look too much different for you guys. So picking up kind of like I said, where we left off with our Learn with Flow series, last week we really got to dive into this conversation around heart rate variability. It was a great setting for us to talk about this concept of wearable technology. We got to plug things like the Oura Ring or Whoop or your Apple Watch, and it really even sparked some good conversations in a lot of my personalized consulting clients, as well as a lot of social media follow-up from that as well. So I wanted to take and kind of graduate and continue this kind of wearables conversation because I think that there's so many different really neat tools out in the health and wellness space, but then there's also that conversation of like, who is the ideal candidate for using these things, who's not an ideal candidate, where does it kind of cross the line in terms of biohacky and useful versus getting into maybe like unnecessary anxiety for some people. So I wanted to make sure that we really had a good conversation to really expand into more of the wearables, especially around some of the conversations I've had with continuous glucose monitors or CGMs. So with the CGM, it's a new world that we're getting into. Previously, only type 2 diabetics specifically, or even some type 1 diabetics would really have access to continuous glucose monitors. They are still behind the counter, so you do still need a prescription for those models unless you're using any of the direct-to-consumer websites now, like a Levels or a NutriSense. So there's some new companies coming out now more and more of getting these types of devices direct to consumers so that they can really look at some other more internal biomarkers as well, such as glycemic control, and really looking at things like blood sugar fluctuations and how those play into our overall health goals as well. So I wanted to give us a stage to really talk about this conversation that I call glycemic control, really being the new hormone flex. I think that there was so much attention and spotlight on things like ketosis and intermittent fasting as these biohacking strategies of the year. And what we're really starting to see is that exactly what we've said the whole time, that these types of dietary strategies, yeah, they may be right for certain people at certain times, but these were designed to be therapeutic interventions. And what I mean by a therapeutic intervention is it wasn't meant to be followed long term. We have to understand that all of the different diet strategies that are out there, they're not all complete garbage, but a lot of them are meant for different seasons of life. And they're also meant for very specific individuals. So even what I do in my practice, when I have somebody that walks in the door, the first thing I'm doing is running labs on them. I'm not going to be recommending willy-nilly dietary strategies on somebody that I haven't seen any labs for. I don't have any health history about. I have no concept of, like I said, what they've tried in the past, what they've been successful with, because really their labs are going to tell me what is going to fit this season of life for them right now. I don't really care what they did in their 20s. It may or may not work for them anymore. I don't really care what their sister or brother-in-law or coworker is doing. Good on them, right? There's so many different dietary tools out there, and it's about aligning the proper tools to that particular person and to your particular metabolic season of life. So when we talk about these different wearable devices like a continuous glucose monitor, I think what we're going to really find, especially in 2023 and beyond, is the nuance behind nutrition and the specificity that is required. And we can't just be making these blanket one-all catch statements about everybody needing to follow a specific diet. And it is all about this one diet as this magic match for everybody, because it's just not true. And I think that it does a big disservice to overall metabolic health. So we really want to talk about even diet as it relates to our stress response. So last week when we were talking about things like our heart rate variability, and we learned how heart rate variability is a metric that determines our overall nervous system function. Even if we don't, I guess, consciously feel stressed, our body may still be responding and perceiving stress from an internal standpoint. One of the biggest ways that our body perceives internal stress is through what we eat, when we eat, how we eat, what we're not eating enough of, what we're eating too much, or what we really call like glycemic stress, right? So our diet can absolutely be a internal, even more unperceived stressor that our body is definitely responding to. So I would say the kind of three main pillars of a dietary strategy that is going to be something that is supportive of our metabolic health goals and supportive of things like HRV and nervous system regulation. We know that regardless of what your diet dogma is, right, wherever your heart is leading you, your diet needs to really hit three main pillars. It has to balance blood sugar. Don't care if you want to be keto, do not care if you want to be vegan or plant-based, or you want to count your calories or count your macros or drink nothing but protein shakes and a juice cleanse. Don't care. Your body always needs to have blood sugar balance in mind. So that's where I think a lot of people get off on like their diet strategy, because they don't think about these things like, oh, so my body actually cares about blood sugar balance first and foremost. Yes, most definitely it does. So number one pillar has to be blood sugar balance, which we'll dive into more today. And then also your diet should make sure that we're correcting for any nutrient deficiencies. Again, I tell people all the time, don't care what diet you want to follow. If you want to be plant-based, vegan, keto, carnivore, paleo, Whole30, doesn't matter. You cannot live having overt nutrient deficiencies, whether that is deficiencies in protein, protein quality, protein quantity, fiber, micronutrients as well too, vitamins and minerals that are key. So regardless of what diet you follow, you can't have overt nutrient deficiencies. Not going to be a healthy diet for you and is going to be sources of stress. And then we get into the third pillar of any sort of diet strategy that's going to be supportive of our overall metabolic health and nervous system function is going to be a diet that you enjoy. It has to be simple. It has to be sustainable. It has to be including foods that are your favorite foods. You have to know how to eat in any social situation that you find yourself in, especially if it's realistic to your lifestyle. You guys, if you and your family eat outside the home multiple times a week, then you need to have a diet strategy that helps you understand, how do I do that and still align to my goals? Or maybe you're a family that enjoys cooking all of your meals at home and you want to buy organic and grass-fed. Great, awesome, you do you, boo, but it has to be simple and sustainable for your life picture. So when I think about, like I said, this kind of bridge from last week's conversations around HRV, nervous system function, stress management, and like an objective measurement of stress management, I want to really dive into all of the different components that are going to impact your HRV, one of them being our diet. And one of the big main reasons where we may not positively impact our HRV with our diet is if we have a diet that does not satisfy blood sugar balance, we have overt nutrient deficiencies, or we're not eating in a way that it's enjoyable and sustainable. All of those things can negatively impact your overall stress response and your overall HRV. So let's really dive into this first pillar as we talk about eating in a way that satisfies blood sugar balance. I would say that this is something that has definitely come up even in a lot of like client conversations. I have a gentleman who I've been working with for quite some time now. He is very body aware. He enjoys eating more of a plant-based approach. And because of this, he has a lot of blood sugar issues. He also tends to have a lot of HRV issues because of it. Not to mention his past of running high stress businesses, exercising himself into the ground. He was a previous alcoholic, like all of these types of different things, right? It's like that kind of play into this picture, but now bringing him to where he's at today, it's like, I have him tracking trends like HRV. I have him tracking trends like sleep. And there was a point in time where he was getting frustrated because he felt like from an HRV standpoint and his overall stress response and his overall recovery and performance, he was hitting a dead end. He was hitting a plateau. He's like, I feel like I'm controlling all that I can control, and I'm not seeing a great uptick in things like recovery and things like HRV. Like my body is still very, very stressed and feeling the downstream ramifications of that. What more can I do? And I asked him, I was like, do you really want to know? And he's like, yes, I really want to know. I was like, we've got to look at your blood sugar balance. I was like, when you enjoy eating more of a plant-based approach, you are by nature more of a carbitarian. So it's like, have you ever worn a continuous glucose monitor? Have you ever looked at how your blood sugar responds to different meals? Have you ever looked at not just high blood sugar responses, but what happens when you go too long without proper fuel, right? Things like blood sugar crashes. So this just really opened a big door of conversation for us, because he then ended up being a really solid candidate for somebody that gets to kind of look at these parameters and find them helpful and beneficial in his overall wellness journey, right? So when we think about HRV and your stress response, just understand that your diet is going to be highly individualized. It will and should change with life seasons. And what helps get one person ripped and shredded with great libido could be the same diet strategy that makes someone else gain weight and makes their hair fall out. So we can't just be sending these blanket one-all diet recommendations out into the universe without understanding metabolic labs first. So with this, I would say going into kind of, like I said, 2023 and beyond, my hope is that we'll start to see more of a shift in the health and wellness world away from this like diet dogma and people really pushing and enforcing one dietary strategy on everybody, and recognizing that regardless of how somebody gets that same means to an end, the new gold standard for hormone balance to me is metabolic flexibility. Metabolic flexibility is a term that we use towards understanding how our body creates energy from our food, right? We have our body that can burn carbohydrates for fuel. That is a process that we call glycolysis. We use glucose for energy for fuel, but then we also should be able to switch into burning fat for fuel, right? That's where the whole ketosis strategy is all around, and producing ketones to like prove that your body is in a fat burning state. Right? But we recognize that the goal is not to 100% of the time be in one state or the other. Your body should have the flexibility, right? Just like we talked about last week, we have this parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. The goal is not to spend 0% of our time ever being exposed to stress. It's not real life. It ain't gonna happen. Don't try. The goal though is that can I slide into a much necessary stress response, and then when that stress is gone, can I slide back out of it? Same thing goes for our blood sugar balance, and same thing goes for our overall metabolic flexibility. There are times where you absolutely want to be able to efficiently burn carbs for energy. Heck yes, during high stress events, during things like exercise, we absolutely want to have the flexibility to be able to tolerate carbohydrates. Being able to go out and enjoy a meal with friends, right? It's like you go too long and you spend all of your time thinking that like, oh, keto is king, and like I never touch a carb or even smell a carb. The second that person who is extremely fat adapted and spends all of their time toting ketosis, they they get exposed to a carbohydrate, they have a huge blood sugar response. Their body is not tolerable to carbohydrates. And then that person turns around, it's like, see, I told you carbs are bad. Carbs are awful. Get them out altogether. It's like, no, carbs are not bad. Your body does not have a great tolerance of carbohydrates because you never expose it to it. It's not flexible. So just like I don't want somebody to be running on carbohydrates all the time, like someone that's a type 2 diabetic, we have a lot of metabolic inflammation. Their body is like using and burning carbohydrates all the time. Their blood sugars are high, their A1C is high, their insulin is high. Of course, I don't want that state. Like that's someone that's stuck as a carb burner. But now we get so much fear mongering around that we get this like gold standard is we should be in this fat burning ketosis all the time. Okay, you want to take that extreme? Now you have no flexibility to be able to switch between those two fuel sources. And that's not a healthy place to be either, because ketosis really does promote usually a lot of, like I said, gut health issues, chronic cortisol issues for a lot of people, especially things like menstruating women or high performance athletes. Like long-term ketosis is actually a stress response. It can break down muscle tissue, so you end up in ketosis, but you end up like skinny fat, because it's like, oh, look at me, I lost a bunch of weight on keto, but you lost like mostly muscle and not necessarily a ton of body fat, right? So I'm not saying that these, like I said, two extremes are not necessary at certain points in time. I just want there to be a better conversation around it and understand that it's all about metabolic flexibility here. It's all about switching back and forth. You should be a carb burner sometimes. Hell yeah. Like I want you to be able to go out and have a meal with friends and not have your blood sugar that skyrockets through the roof and it takes 4 hours to come back down to baseline, and you're so carb intolerant that you can't even enjoy like nature's carbohydrates like fruits and whole grains. Like our body should absolutely be able to tolerate those great high fiber sources. But I don't want to get stuck in one of these places or the other. So just understand that I think this big awareness and fear around high blood sugars have kind of led us down a pathway of being so nervous about high blood sugars that we then avoid carbohydrates altogether and get very, very fat adapted, which then doesn't bode well for this metabolic flexibility picture. So insert what we know now about, like I said, the metabolism and these wearable devices and how we can truly see, okay, high blood sugars, no bueno. Like not great for overall nervous system function, overall stress, overall metabolic health, or our waistline. Obviously not. But we also don't want to necessarily take this extreme approach and just say, carbs are bad, I never live around carbs, or these like extreme approaches around like intermittent fasting and I only eat between noon and 4 p.m. every day and I maybe ingest a whopping 600 to 1,000 calories a day. Like these really extreme low calorie or calorie controlled approaches, or like macronutrient demonizing approaches. Don't let those be a guise of healthy either, right? Both of those extremes to me don't necessarily paint a really solid, healthy metabolic picture. A healthy stress response should be able to turn stress on and off, right? I need the sympathetic nervous system sometimes, but I can also shut it off. Same thing when it comes to glycemic control. It's like, I know that there's a time and a place that my body will burn carbs for fuel and it actually feels better to burn carbs for fuel, but then I also know how to shut it off and get back to burning fat for fuel. It's this concept of metabolic flexibility, and having that understanding of where and how to use those can be exponentially important. And it's probably a lot of what I do in my practice is helping people understand like what diet strategies are right for them and what diet strategies and tools are meant for somebody else and may be doing them actually a metabolic disservice. So when we think about the real kind of, like I said, metabolic flex here, I don't think it's bragging about ketones and ketosis anymore. I don't think it's bragging about your fasting window. And I definitely don't think it's bragging about how few of calories you can live on every day without passing out. I don't. So I think the real flex is coming in and being like, yes, look at me. I tolerate a wide diversity of diets, and I also know how can I fuel myself the most and still control the body composition and performance that I want to control. I think it's way more impressive out there to see someone that eats a healthy amount of energy intake and doesn't restrict themselves and moves their body and uses that fuel towards building muscle, towards accomplishing their goals, towards their metabolic health and their mental health, right? I think that's way more impressive to see someone out there like eating good in the neighborhood versus restricting themselves. There's no pride in that, and there's definitely no longevity in that. So when I think about using some of these tools out there to be able to really measure things like metabolic flexibility, do I have the ability to control my glucose response? Right? Or am I stuck and I don't have a lot of metabolic flexibility, and anytime I eat a carbohydrate, it sets me off, right? I'm that kind of insulin resistant picture. Or I am high blood sugars all the time that I can't get myself out of that carb burning state and into a fat burning state. Tools that loop in here are things like continuous glucose monitors or even things like glucometers. There's another product out on the market. I have mixed opinions on it because I haven't used it myself, but it's called the Lumen. It's really just a fancy way that we used in like our exercise physiology labs in my master's degree all the time, using things like respiratory quotient to be able to determine someone that's in a carbohydrate burning state or a fat burning state. What fuel source are they pulling from most predominantly? So there's all sorts of different devices out there that are finally coming to this conclusion of like, oh, so the goal is metabolic flexibility. The goal isn't to be a diabetic, but the goal also isn't to pride myself on how low can I get my blood sugar and how high can I get my ketones. It's like, yeah, no. Those are not ever the end goal. So when I use something like a continuous glucose monitor, there's multiple ones, like I said, out there on the market. I think there are good candidates for them, and I think there are poor candidates for them. But at least for our conversation today, know that things like a continuous glucose monitor and even using consistent labs, you can draw a lot in a good set of labs like fasting blood sugar, fasting insulin, hemoglobin A1C. You can measure a 24-hour cortisol response. All of these types of things giving us a very, very strong picture of overall metabolic health and metabolic flexibility as well. If you were to use a tool like a continuous glucose monitor, I have the question sometimes where people are like, if I want to track blood sugar markers, like what do I measure? What am I looking for? So there's a few that I at least want to highlight and give you guys some attention towards if you're curious about digging into some of these things. The first thing that you want to look at is a fasting blood sugar. So about an hour after waking up, the only thing you've had at this point is water, right? Not coffee, not breakfast, but like about a 30 minutes to an hour after waking up, you could do a fasting blood sugar reading. The goal is that your fasting blood sugar is between 70 and 90 milligrams per deciliter. Again, this is not something that usually from a traditional medicine standpoint, they won't say anything until your fasting blood sugar is well over 100. In my mind, it's like, yep, that's been a problem for a while. So this gray area is kind of like 70 to, or this gray area is like 90 to 100. People come to me quite frequently and their blood sugar is like 95, 96, 98. And they're like, oh yeah, my doctor's always said my blood sugar is great. I'm like, yeah, and I'm saying it's not. Right? This is something that we definitely want to dig into a little bit. So 70 to 90 for a fasting blood sugar metric. You can also look at, this is a little bit easier if you have a continuous glucose monitor, but you can also do this with just like a finger prick glucometer too. You can do a meal test. And what a meal test is you're going to measure your blood sugar before you start eating. You're going to measure your blood sugar an hour after you've finished eating, which should catch the peak of the blood sugar response of that meal. And then you're going to measure your blood sugar again 2 hours after eating. So right when you eat, an hour and 2 hours, and you should be able to draw a nice little graph or a nice little curve and see how did your blood sugar react to that meal, right? So you kind of want to do little meal tests or meal experiments to see how your body responds to certain meals, right? So it's like, oh, I took my blood sugar and it was at 100. I ate pizza and wings for dinner. I took my blood sugar an hour later and my blood sugar was at 200. And then 2 hours later, it was at 150, right? So you're kind of drawing this curve. The goal is at any point in time, a meal should not delta change. Like from the time that you start eating to the 1 hour mark, we don't want more than a 30 to 40 point rise or change. So if you started at 100, the goal is that the meal doesn't spike you higher than like a 130 or a 140. That would mean that that meal composition was pretty blood sugar balancing for you, right? So you can imagine how everybody is going to be a little bit different. I could eat one meal and someone else could eat the exact same meal. We have two different glycemic responses. So then both of us need to kind of, like I said, adjust accordingly. That's why nutrition is so nuanced, is because it needs to match glycemic variability for you, or metabolic flexibility for you. So ideally no more than a 30 to 40% change for like any sort of meal challenge. You also want your blood sugar to be able to return back to baseline within 2 hours without a crash. So again, some individuals, it's not just the blood sugar highs, but it's what we call reactive hypoglycemia that can be a first signs and stages of things like insulin resistance. So I've seen individuals like this too, where their blood sugars look great on paper, but they're very symptomatic of blood sugar issues. So I slap a continuous glucose monitor on them, and sure enough, it's like their meals are climbing and then they're crashing. And it's like they bypassed baseline and they went like too high, too low. And that reactive hypoglycemia tells me that we lack metabolic flexibility. And that's something that we need to work on. The other piece that you want to measure as well too is a fasting insulin. That's usually done more in a laboratory setting, and a fasting insulin should stay below 7. Most of the time, fasting insulin is something that we track in trend years before somebody has an overt blood sugar issue. So say, for example, your blood sugar is 75 in a fasted state, but then your insulin is 15 or 20 when you measure it in a fasting state. That's not good. Like, that's still signs of early insulin resistance. And if we can do something about it now, then it won't turn into a full-blown prediabetes or type 2 diabetes scenario. So when we're thinking about utilizing some of these tools that help us really determine things like, what is my metabolic flexibility? Do I have the ability to burn carbohydrates when necessary, but switch over to fat burn most of the time? Kind of like, can I switch into a stress state, a sympathetic state when needed, but then switch it off and come back to this parasympathetic state? That is the goal of metabolic flexibility. And so I would say that, like I said, good candidates for people of wearing a continuous glucose monitor would be somebody that is, like I said, kind of maximized a lot of these different dietary tools, and they're still not seeing great success when it comes to things like tracking HRV or their stress response or body composition change can be pretty eye-opening. Also, if you're just symptomatic of blood sugar issues, whether that's feeling fatigued after meals, lots of sugar, salt cravings, if you crash between meals, high stress response, stuff like that. What I would not say, people that are a good candidate for a CGM, is someone that is very easily anxious about data. And I say this with the utmost respect, because even with some of these CGM companies, like I follow this, like the Facebook group for NutriSense. And so it's a continuous glucose monitoring company, but they have just like, everyday general population people wearing these CGMs with no idea how to interpret their data. And they are out there, like, you should see this Facebook page. I literally just joined it for mostly the entertainment value of it, because the recommendations are wild. Like, people giving each other blanket recommendations based off of what their CGM says. And it's like, oh, I saw a little rise in my glucose when I ate an avocado. Does that mean that avocados are bad for me? And people will light up the comments and they're like, yeah, avocados are out. You must have a food sensitivity to avocados, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, oh my gosh, no, stop giving this person horrible advice. This is garbage. Like, that's not why her blood sugar went up 10 points when she ate an avocado. Like, that's a perfectly natural response, and that is a perfectly healthy food. Like, so you have to be very careful of, if you're somebody that doesn't have someone to work with to interpret the data, it can be a little bit overwhelming. And again, you get really, really poor advice. Again, same group, or I'll see people and they're like, oh, I can't get my fasting blood sugar below 100. What do you guys recommend? And people will flood the comments and they're like, you need to move to a 20 hours off, 4 hours on fueling window. You need to do, like, the only thing that worked for me was, intermittent fasting with keto. Also watch your saturated fats and keep your calories under 800 a day. I read some of these comments and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is why we have disordered eating habits and metabolic health issues in America, because people are crazy when it comes to nutrition advice. And I'm like, that's not how the body works. You can keep trying all of those different strategies that like push you farther and farther and farther into this so-called like magic land of ketosis. I'm like, that's not the world of fixing your blood sugars. Fixing your blood sugars is about rebuilding and restoring metabolic flexibility. It's not about driving you into the ground and lower with like more fasting, less carbs, less calories. And like there's this pride out there around measuring my ketones and I'm hardly eating anything and I'm doing all this high intensity exercise and I fast for 20 hours a day. It's like, yeah, no. That is really just exacerbating the lack of metabolic flexibility, and your only way out is up. So that's where I wanted to at least give you guys a little bit of a glimpse into my world around some of these other wearables like the continuous glucose monitors. I think that they are valuable information for individuals that are working with a practitioner to be able to interpret the data properly and give them like proper meal tests and experiments to do to see what their body responds to best. But the goal being to restore metabolic flexibility and stable blood sugar responses, not like eliminate blood sugar movement whatsoever, because that's absolutely normal, and not to create, like I said, more nutrient deficiencies or create more stress, but we really just want to restore proper metabolic flexibility because that's how your body works. It should be able to turn systems on and turn systems off for certain points in time, and that is a perfectly healthy response. So if you're curious about utilizing some of these wearable stuff that I've been talking about, don't be shy. Hit up the comments of this and we can, like I said, answer some of those more common questions. Or if you have any interest in diving into things like metabolic flexibility for yourself, or you kind of feel that you've been that person that's like, ooh, I've kind of been so nervous about maybe some of these like higher blood sugar trends, that I have been that person that's been diving into like diet after diet, keto after carnivore, after exclusion, after don't eat this, don't eat that, fasting windows. And you're like, and now I'm down here where I feel like I can't even look at a cupcake and I gain weight. Like, we got to get and build out of that because it's not going to be a great long-term strategy. So if you have questions or concerns, head over to the Lowdown on Nutrition at my Instagram page. You can click at the link there, and there is information about my courses. You can click and apply to work with me one-on-one. So if you're interested in any of that, the first step in the door is to apply to work with me one-on-one, and then we can go from there. So hopefully this was helpful for you guys today. If you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate, and we'll be back for next week, another session of Learn with Lo.